The wind howled outside the broken windows of the orphanage, and within its cold, crumbling walls, a little girl sat by herself, watching the raindrops race down the cracked glass. Her name was Lily, a name that conjured innocence, but her heart had already begun to harden in the face of a world that had shown her little kindness. She was 6 when she first felt it, that pang of longing for something more than the bleak, joyless life she had known. Every day, she watched from a distance as other children were adopted, led away by smiling parents to a life she could only dream of. And as the years passed, each rejection, each day that she remained behind, deepened the void inside her. On sunny afternoons, families would come to the orphanage, their children laughing, their parents holding hands. Lily would press her face against the window, her breath fogging the glass as she watched them with a bitterness she didn't yet understand. It wasn't just that she wanted what they had, it was that she hated them for having it. The happiness of others gnawed at her insides, turning her envy into something darker. By the time she turned 18, she was no longer a child waiting for rescue. She had learned that no one was coming for her, and the world would never give her what she wanted unless she took it for herself. She left the orphanage on a dreary autumn morning, the cold biting through her thin coat as she walked down the street, determined but aimless. The city loomed ahead of her, full of strangers, full of opportunities. Lily had no money, no family, and no friends. But she had something else: her beauty. She had always been beautiful. Even as a child, she had turned heads, and now, at 18, that beauty had bloomed into something intoxicating, something dangerous. Her emerald eyes glinted beneath dark lashes, and her hair cascaded like a river of midnight. She knew the effect she had on people, on men, and she had seen how a smile or a glance could make them forget themselves, even if only for a moment. It was on her second day in the city that she first put her plan into motion. She had wandered into a high-end restaurant, hungry but too proud to beg. Sitting at the bar, she caught the eye of a man in his 40s, his wedding ring gleaming under the soft lights. He smiled at her, and she smiled back, a slow, seductive curve of her lips. She didn't need to ask him for anything. He offered before she could speak. Dinner, wine, and more. As she sat across from him, sipping the wine he'd ordered, Lily listened to his stories about his wife, his children, his perfect suburban life. It was almost too easy. With every word, she knew she could destroy it all. And in that moment, as she looked into his eyes and saw the desire flicker behind the veil of his marriage, she realized something. She didn't just want to be loved. She wanted to take away what others loved. That night, for the first time, she slept in a hotel room, not a shelter or a street corner. The man had paid for everything, just as she had known he would. As he kissed her goodbye in the early hours of the morning, his guilt barely hidden behind a facade of gratitude, Lily felt the first stirrings of power. This was her new life. This was how she would survive. By the end of that month, Lily had seduced 2 more men, each one wealthier than the last. She had learned how to pick them, men who wore their marriages like chains, who longed for something exciting, something forbidden. And with each man, she took a little more: money, gifts, and most of all, their peace. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Lily wanted more than just trinkets and fleeting pleasures. She wanted security, she wanted luxury, and she would stop at nothing to get it. Lily walked through the crowded city streets, her heels clicking against the pavement with every determined step. The morning sun shone brightly overhead, casting long shadows behind her, but it did nothing to ease the chill that had settled deep in her bones. For the first time since leaving the orphanage, she was completely alone. The freedom she had longed for, the escape from the suffocating walls of the orphanage, had not been the release she had expected. Instead, it tasted bitter. She had imagined that once she was free, the world would open its arms to her. But the city was an unforgiving place. She had no one to turn to, no real skills to speak of, and the men she had seduced so far had only provided her with enough to scrape by. A few nights in fancy hotels, some new clothes, and a handful of stolen moments were hardly enough to secure the life she craved. Lily had underestimated the world's cruelty. She had thought her beauty would be her weapon, but she was quickly learning that it wasn't enough to just look pretty. She needed to be smarter, more calculated. If she wanted to rise above the filth and poverty she had been born into, she would need to do more than rely on fleeting attention. She would need to manipulate it, control it. The men she had seduced were weak, easily led by their desires. But Lily realized that what she really needed was to find men with power, men who could give her more than just a night of comfort. She needed men who had the means to elevate her from the streets permanently. She needed to stop thinking small. With that revelation, Lily's outlook shifted. She began to spend her days in the wealthiest parts of town, studying the kind of people who frequented the upscale restaurants and exclusive clubs. She watched them carefully, learning their habits, memorizing their patterns. She began to understand what truly motivated them: their insecurities, their egos, their lust for power, and their need to feel desired. And then she met Gregory. He was everything she had been searching for. A successful businessman in his 50s, with a reputation for ruthlessness in the boardroom and a perfect family life in the suburbs. But beneath the polished exterior, Gregory was just as hollow as the rest. She had seen him first in a coffee shop, seated at the corner table with his morning newspaper. He glanced at her over the rim of his glasses, his gaze lingering just a second too long. That was all she needed. It started with a simple conversation, an innocent smile. She played her part perfectly, demure, charming, never too forward. Gregory was intrigued, of course. They always were. His office was only a few blocks away, and he invited her to lunch later that week. From there, it didn't take long for their relationship to progress. He began visiting her in secret, telling her how unhappy he was at home, how his wife didn't understand him, how his children were ungrateful. Lily knew better than to care about his problems. She played the part of the attentive listener, all the while calculating her next move. She had him hooked, and soon she began to ask for more. At first, it was small things: money for rent, a new dress. Gregory obliged without question, eager to please her. But Lily's ambitions grew larger with every favor he granted. As the weeks passed, Gregory's attachment deepened. He began talking about leaving his wife, starting a new life with Lily. She pretended to entertain the idea, though she had no intention of sharing her life with him. For Lily, Gregory was a means to an end. She wasn't interested in love, not with him or anyone else. Love was a weakness she had sworn to never indulge in. What she wanted was his wealth, his connections, and the freedom that came with them. One evening, as they lay together in the penthouse suite he had rented for their rendezvous, Gregory made her a proposition. He offered to buy her a house, a lavish property in the heart of the city where they could meet in private, away from prying eyes. The offer was exactly what Lily had been waiting for. She accepted with a smile, though inside she was already planning her next steps. The house was beyond anything Lily had ever dreamed of. It was a sprawling estate with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and a view of the city skyline that took her breath away. She moved in the following week, leaving behind the dingy hotel rooms and cramped apartments she had called home for the past few months. But even as she settled into her new life of luxury, Lily knew this was only the beginning. She had Gregory under her control, but there were still bigger fish to catch. The men in Gregory's world were wealthier, more powerful, and far more dangerous than any she had encountered before. But Lily wasn't afraid. She had tasted freedom, and she would do whatever it took to keep it. As the days passed, Lily began hosting small gatherings at her new home. Gregory introduced her to his colleagues and associates, men who admired her beauty and charm. She played the role of the perfect hostess, always attentive, always alluring. Behind her soft smiles and gentle laughter, she was already calculating who her next target would be. Gregory was useful, but he was still too attached to his family to fully commit to her. Lily needed a man who was willing to risk everything for her, someone who could give her not just money, but status and influence. She watched them all closely, searching for the right one, the next stepping stone in her rise to power. Freedom had come at a cost, but Lily had paid it gladly. She was no longer the orphan girl longing for a family, nor the naive young woman wandering the city streets. She was something else now, something stronger, more dangerous. She had learned that in a world as unforgiving as this, the only way to survive was to take what you wanted, and Lily wanted it all. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the hum of low conversations. The clink of crystal glasses echoed softly, and Lily stood at the center of it all, a vision of elegance in her form-fitting black dress. Her lips curled into a practiced smile, her emerald eyes scanning the crowd. These gatherings, hosted in her new home, were more than just social events. They were her hunting grounds. Each man who walked through her door was a potential opportunity, a stepping stone in her ascent. But tonight, there was one in particular she had her sights set on. His name was Richard Sterling, a wealthy real estate mogul known for his cold, calculated demeanor and the empire he had built. He was married, of course. Happily, if you believe the tabloids. But Lily had long since learned that happily married was a lie people told themselves to mask their dissatisfaction. Richard had arrived late, his towering figure commanding attention the moment he entered the room. He was different from the others, less eager to please, more reserved. Where most men tripped over themselves to win Lily's favor, Richard remained distant, watching her from across the room with an unreadable expression. That intrigued her. It had been a long time since a man made her feel like she had to work for his attention. The challenge excited her. She moved through the room with grace, casually making her way toward him, but never too quickly. Lily knew how to play this game. She had mastered the art of seduction, the delicate balance of giving just enough to leave them wanting more. She would draw Richard in slowly, make him think it was his idea all along. When their eyes finally met, Lily felt the familiar rush of power. She let her lips part in a soft smile, one that promised secrets yet to be revealed. Richard didn't smile back, but his eyes lingered on her, and that was all the confirmation she needed. "Mr. Sterling," she greeted him, her voice smooth like silk. "I'm so glad you could join us this evening." He inclined his head slightly, his expression still neutral. "Miss Davenport," he replied, using the surname Lily had adopted after leaving the orphanage. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you." His voice was deep, commanding, and Lily could hear the subtle undertone of control. Most men tried to charm her, to flatter her, but Richard didn't bother with any of that. He was testing her, watching how she would respond. Lily tilted her head, her eyes never leaving his. "I've heard quite a bit about you, Mr. Sterling," she said, her tone light, teasing. "All good things, of course." A flicker of amusement crossed his face, almost imperceptible. "I'm sure," he replied, his voice dry. "And what about you, Miss Davenport? I've heard you've made quite the impression on some of my associates." There it was, the opening she needed. She could feel the shift in the air between them, the subtle change in his demeanor. He was interested, though he wouldn't admit it outright. "I do try," she said, her smile widening ever so slightly. "Though I'm sure you know how it is. Sometimes people only see what they want to see." Richard raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her answer. "And what is it that people see when they look at you?" Lily laughed softly, a low, melodic sound. "That depends on the person," she said. "Some see a young woman who's come into wealth too quickly. Others see someone who's simply taken advantage of the opportunities presented to her. But I suppose the real question is, what do you see, Mr. Sterling?" The question hung in the air between them, charged with a tension that neither of them acknowledged aloud. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze sharpening as he studied her. It was a challenge, and Lily knew it, but she wasn't afraid. She thrived on moments like this, when the stakes were high and the rewards even higher. "I see a woman who knows exactly what she's doing," he said after a long pause, his voice measured. "And I'd wager you're very good at it." Lily's smile didn't waver. She had expected no less from him. Richard was the kind of man who liked to be in control, who admired strength in others because it reflected his own. But beneath his composed exterior, she could sense something more, a desire for excitement, for something outside the rigid structure of his carefully controlled life. And Lily was more than happy to provide it. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of small talk and stolen glances. Richard never strayed far from her side, but he also never made a move, never gave any indication that he was interested in more than conversation. But Lily knew better. She had seen the way his eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking, the way his voice softened ever so slightly when he addressed her directly. He wanted her. He just didn't know it yet. Over the next few weeks, Lily continued to cultivate her relationship with Richard, playing the long game. She didn't push him, didn't try to force his hand. Instead, she let him come to her, letting him think he was in control. She knew how to make herself seem unattainable, just out of reach. And it worked. Richard began to call her, first under the pretense of discussing business, then more frequently just to check in. Their conversations were always brief, but each one brought him closer. Each one tightened the web she was weaving around him. Finally, after a particularly long dinner one evening, Richard made his move. They had been sitting in the dimly lit corner of an exclusive restaurant, their conversation flowing easily. Lily had laughed at one of his stories, her hand resting lightly on his arm. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to break whatever resolve he had left. "I shouldn't be doing this," Richard muttered as they stood outside the restaurant, his voice low. He glanced around nervously, as if expecting someone to jump out from the shadows and catch them in the act. Lily stepped closer to him, her voice soft and soothing. "Then don't," she whispered, her lips brushing against his ear. "No one's forcing you." Richard hesitated, his internal struggle written all over his face, but Lily knew she had him. She could feel the tension in the air, the pull between them. All it would take was one more push. She leaned in closer, her breath warm against his skin. "Come with me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Just for tonight." Richard closed his eyes, his jaw tightening. For a moment, Lily thought he might resist. But then, with a heavy sigh, he nodded. And just like that, she had him. As they walked down the quiet streets toward her home, Lily felt a familiar rush of victory. She had played her part perfectly, and now Richard Sterling, one of the most powerful men in the city, was hers. But even as she reveled in her success, a part of her was already thinking ahead, already calculating her next move. Richard was a prize, yes, but he wasn't the endgame. He was just another step in her climb to the top, another man to use, to manipulate, to discard when he had served his purpose. Because Lily didn't just want wealth or power, she wanted everything. Richard Sterling was not like the others. He didn't lose control as easily, and he didn't fall head over heels for Lily as quickly as most men did. But that only made the challenge more thrilling. His wealth, his power, it was all so close, just waiting for her to seize it. She could already feel the luxury of his world creeping into hers. The extravagant dinners, the expensive gifts, the whispered promises of things yet to come. But there was something else about Richard that Lily hadn't anticipated, a complication. Unlike her previous conquests, Richard was deeply tied to his family. He spoke of them often, even when he was with her, as though reminding himself of what was at stake. His wife, Laura, had a reputation for being as sharp and as formidable as Richard himself, and his two sons were already being groomed to take over his empire one day. This family was not something he could easily discard. Lily understood that if she wanted to take everything from Richard, she would need to destroy the very thing he was clinging to, his family. But she had done it before. Breaking apart marriages was her specialty, and this one would be no different. The plan unfolded slowly, meticulously. Lily knew better than to rush. She had learned the hard way that impatience could cost her everything. Instead, she began to sow small seeds of doubt in Richard's mind. It started with subtle comments, casual observations about how distant his wife seemed, how his sons rarely called unless they needed something. Richard, already burdened by the pressures of his career, began to internalize these remarks, questioning the solidity of his home life. As the weeks passed, their meetings grew more frequent. Richard's guilt seemed to weigh heavier on him with each visit, but Lily knew that guilt was just another tool to manipulate. She played the perfect part, offering him comfort, reassurance, and validation. She made him believe that she was the only person who truly understood him, the only one who cared. And soon enough, Richard began to talk about leaving. It started as a quiet confession, late one night as they lay together in her lavish bed. Richard stared at the ceiling, his expression hard to read. "Sometimes, I wonder what it would be like to just walk away," he muttered, his voice thick with exhaustion. Lily turned on her side, her fingers tracing lazy circles on his chest. "Walk away from what?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Everything," he said with a heavy sigh. "The business, the family, it's all so much. I'm tired, Lily. I'm tired of pretending everything's perfect when it's falling apart behind closed doors." Lily's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "You don't have to pretend with me," she whispered. "You deserve to be happy, Richard. You deserve to live your life the way you want." He looked at her then, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "Do you think I could?" he asked, almost as if he were seeking her permission. Lily smiled softly, leaning in to kiss him. "You can do whatever you want," she murmured against his lips. "You've earned that right." That was the moment she knew she had him. Over the next few weeks, Richard's visits became longer, and his conversations became more focused on the possibility of leaving his family. He was still hesitant, still conflicted, but Lily knew that it was only a matter of time before he made the final decision. But as she inched closer to her goal, a new problem began to emerge: Laura Sterling. Lily had never met Laura in person, but she had heard enough about her to know that she was not a woman to be underestimated. Unlike the wives of the other men Lily had seduced, Laura wasn't just a trophy. She was intelligent, influential, and fiercely protective of her family. And lately, she had started to suspect that something was wrong. One evening, as Richard sat across from her at dinner, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening as he read the message. Lily watched him carefully, sensing the tension in his posture. "Everything okay?" she asked, feigning concern. Richard shook his head, setting the phone down with a heavy sigh. "It's Laura," he muttered. "She's been asking questions. I think she knows something's going on." Lily's heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice soft, careful not to sound too eager. Richard rubbed his temples, clearly torn. "I don't know. I've been avoiding it, hoping she'd back off, but she's too smart for that. If I don't tell her the truth soon, she'll figure it out on her own." Lily bit her lip, pretending to think. "Maybe it's time," she said gently. "Maybe it's time to be honest with her." Richard looked at her, his eyes filled with dread. "You don't understand," he said, his voice laced with fear. "If I tell her, she'll take everything. The house, the kids, the company. I'll lose everything I've worked for." Lily leaned forward, her hand resting on his. "You won't lose everything," she whispered. "You'll still have me. We can build something together, Richard. You don't need her." His gaze softened, and for a moment, Lily thought she had won. But then his face hardened again, and he pulled his hand away. "It's not that simple," he said, standing up abruptly. "I need time to think." Lily watched him go, her stomach churning with frustration. She had come so close, but Richard was slipping away from her. If he chose to stay with his wife, everything she had worked for would be for nothing. But Lily wasn't about to let that happen. The next day, she made a decision. If Richard wouldn't leave his wife on his own, she would make the choice for him. She hired a private investigator, a man with a reputation for digging up dirt on even the most careful of people. It didn't take long for him to find what she was looking for. Laura Sterling had secrets of her own, secrets that would destroy her perfect image if they ever came to light. Lily didn't hesitate. She sent the incriminating information to Richard, knowing it would force him to make a choice. And just as she had anticipated, Richard called her later that night, his voice shaking with anger and betrayal. "She lied to me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "All these years, and she lied to me." Lily played her part perfectly, comforting him, reassuring him that he was right to feel betrayed. And by the end of the conversation, Richard had made his decision. "I'm done with her," he said. "I'm leaving, and I'm taking everything with me." It was the victory Lily had been waiting for. Richard had finally severed ties with his wife, and now all of his wealth, his power, his influence, it was all hers. But as she sat alone in her luxurious home, sipping a glass of wine, a strange emptiness settled over her. She had won, just as she always did. But for the first time, the victory didn't taste as sweet. Because deep down, Lily knew that Richard Sterling was just the first of many. And no matter how much she took, no matter how many lives she destroyed, it would never be enough. Lily had everything she thought she wanted: the sprawling mansion, the glittering jewels, the high society connections, everything that symbolized the wealth and status she had craved for so long. Richard Sterling had left his wife, just as she had planned, and he had transferred a significant portion of his wealth to accounts they shared. In public, she was now seen as the powerful, glamorous partner of one of the city's most prominent men. In private, she was still the calculating, ruthless woman she had always been. But as the days passed, Lily began to realize that wealth alone was not enough. The house, the cars, the luxury, none of it filled the emptiness that had been growing inside her. She had achieved what she thought was her ultimate goal, but instead of satisfaction, she felt an increasing sense of restlessness. She had taken everything from Richard, but now she needed more power, more influence. She had to climb higher, and she knew there were still bigger players in the game. Lily's ambition had become a ravenous hunger. Her relationship with Richard, once fiery and full of passion, had cooled. He was now more of a business partner than a lover, and Lily liked it that way. She didn't need his affection or devotion. She needed his connections. Richard was valuable as a stepping stone to bigger opportunities, and Lily was always thinking ahead. Her rise in social circles was swift. At every gala, every charity event, Lily was the woman everyone wanted to be seen with. She played her part flawlessly, the charming, intelligent, and beautiful partner to Richard, who now paraded her as a symbol of his newfound freedom. But beneath the surface, Lily was always watching, always planning. It wasn't long before she caught the attention of someone even more powerful, Daniel Pierce. Daniel was a venture capitalist, a man with far-reaching influence in the city's most lucrative industries. He was known for being ruthless, both in business and in his personal life. His wealth dwarfed Richard's, and unlike Richard, Daniel was completely untethered. No wife, no family, just his empire, and the people who orbited him like moths to a flame. Lily had met him at a fundraising event, one of the many where the city's elite gathered to show off their wealth under the guise of philanthropy. She had noticed him as soon as she entered the room, standing apart from the crowd, his presence commanding attention without even trying. He was tall, with dark hair that was just beginning to gray at the temples, and sharp blue eyes that seemed to see through everyone around him. Lily had learned over time how to spot the men who could give her what she wanted, and Daniel was exactly that kind of man. But he was different from Richard. Daniel wasn't looking for love or even a superficial connection. He was looking for power, and Lily was determined to show him that she was someone worth aligning with. She approached him casually, offering a glass of champagne and a soft smile. "You seem like someone who's seen enough of these events to know that nothing interesting happens until much later in the evening," she said with a playful edge in her voice. Daniel turned his piercing gaze toward her, his lips curling into a small, almost amused smile. "I suppose that depends on your definition of interesting," he replied, his voice low and smooth. Lily tilted her head, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I think we both know that the real deals are made when the cameras aren't watching." Daniel's eyes flickered with interest. "You're not wrong," he said, taking a sip of his drink. "But I don't believe we've met. Daniel Pierce." "Lily Davenport," she replied, extending her hand. He took it, his grip firm but not overpowering. "I've heard a lot about you, Mr. Pierce. All good things, of course." Daniel chuckled softly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I doubt that, but I've heard some things about you as well. Sterling's new partner, isn't it?" Lily smiled, a knowing glint in her eyes. "For now," she said simply. That was all it took to spark Daniel's interest. Over the next few weeks, Lily began to cultivate her relationship with him, much as she had with Richard. But this time, she wasn't content to be someone's kept woman. With Daniel, Lily had to prove that she was more than just a pretty face, that she could hold her own in his world. She began attending business meetings, sitting in on conversations that were far above the heads of most of the women in her social circle. She listened, learned, and slowly began to contribute in subtle but meaningful ways. Daniel was impressed. He hadn't expected Lily to be so astute, so aware of the complexities of power and influence. And Lily played it perfectly, never pushing too hard, always giving just enough to make him want more. Richard noticed the shift in her attention, but by this point, he was too wrapped up in his own problems to care. His divorce had become messy, and his sons had sided with their mother, cutting him out of their lives. Richard's empire, once solid, was beginning to crack under the strain of personal and professional pressures, and Lily knew it was only a matter of time before he crumbled entirely. But she didn't care. She had moved on to bigger things. Daniel Pierce was everything she had been waiting for. He was wealthy, powerful, and most importantly, He wasn't weighed down by emotional baggage. He understood the game Lily was playing because he played it too. They were two predators circling each other, each knowing that their partnership was built on mutual benefit rather than trust. As Lily spent more time with Daniel, she began to see just how far she could go. Daniel introduced her to people who made Richard's business connections look like small-time players. She dined with CEOs, politicians, and even media moguls, each one more powerful than the last. And with every introduction, Lily's influence grew. She was no longer just the pretty woman on Richard's arm. She was becoming a force in her own right. But with every step she took, the stakes grew higher. The people in Daniel's world were dangerous, and Lily knew that one wrong move could cost her everything. She had to be careful, had to play her cards perfectly. And as much as she enjoyed the thrill of the game, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that her rise to power was building towards something she wasn't yet prepared for. One evening, after a particularly successful dinner with some of Daniel's associates, Lily sat alone in her bedroom, gazing out at the city lights. The skyline glittered in the distance, a symbol of everything she had fought for. But for the first time, the view didn't fill her with pride. Instead, it felt empty, hollow. Lily had wealth, power, and influence. She had taken everything she had ever wanted from the men who crossed her path. But as she stared out at the city below, she couldn't help but wonder, how much further could she go before it all came crashing down? The higher she climbed, the more dangerous the fall. Lily had always been a master of wearing masks. From the innocent orphan to the seductress, she had perfected the art of becoming whoever she needed to be to get what she wanted. But as she climbed higher into the world of the powerful and elite, the masks became heavier, more difficult to maintain. And now, with Daniel Pierce, they were beginning to crack. Publicly, she and Daniel were the picture of a glamorous power couple. He brought her to every important event, introduced her to influential figures, and treated her as his equal in business conversations. They appeared inseparable, and Lily reveled in the attention they commanded wherever they went. But behind closed doors, their relationship was far more complicated. Daniel had never been one for emotional entanglements. Their partnership was built on mutual benefit, and both of them knew it. But as Lily spent more time in his world, she began to see a side of him that he kept hidden from everyone else. Beneath the confident, ruthless exterior was a man who thrived on control. Control over his business, over his associates, and over her. It started small, almost imperceptible at first. He would make subtle comments about her appearance, suggest how she should dress for certain events, or what she should say to specific people. Lily, always adept at playing along, accepted these suggestions without protest. After all, she was used to adapting to whatever role was required of her. But soon, Daniel's control extended beyond appearances. He began to dictate more of her time, insisting that she accompany him to meetings, events, and even private dinners with clients. He didn't ask, he expected. And for the first time, Lily found herself in a position where she couldn't easily manipulate the situation. Daniel wasn't like Richard or the other men she had seduced. He didn't fall victim to her charm or her beauty. He saw through her games, and though he respected her intelligence, he also made it clear that in his world, he was the one in charge. Lily had always been the one pulling the strings, but now she found herself entangled in a web of her own making. Daniel's influence was vast, and if she tried to break free from him, it could ruin everything she had built. She couldn't afford to lose him. Not yet. But the more time she spent with him, the more suffocated she felt. The lavish parties, the expensive dinners, the high-stakes business meetings, they all began to blur together, each one more meaningless than the last. Lily played her part perfectly, smiling and laughing at the right moments, but inside, she was restless. She had climbed so high, yet she felt more trapped than ever. It didn't help that rumors were starting to circulate. Richard Sterling, once a powerful ally, had fallen into disgrace after his divorce, and whispers about Lily's involvement in his downfall were spreading through the city's elite circles. People began to question how she had risen so quickly, how she had moved from Richard to Daniel with such ease. She had always been good at controlling the narrative, but now it was slipping away from her. The mask she had worn for so long was beginning to slip. One evening, After yet another business dinner with Daniel's associates, Lily returned home feeling drained. The moment she stepped into her bedroom, she collapsed onto the bed, her mind racing with thoughts she had been trying to suppress for weeks. Was this what she wanted? She had everything she had dreamed of: wealth, power, influence. But at what cost? She had become a prisoner in her own life, bound by the very success she had fought so hard to achieve. She glanced at her reflection in the mirror across the room. The woman staring back at her was a stranger, beautiful, poised, and powerful, but hollow. The emptiness she had felt since her days in the orphanage had only grown, and no amount of wealth or success could fill it. Lily's phone buzzed on the nightstand, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Daniel, asking her to meet him at his office in the morning. She sighed, feeling the weight of his control pressing down on her once again. She knew she couldn't refuse, but a part of her was beginning to rebel against the life she had created. The next morning, Lily arrived at Daniel's office, her mind still clouded with doubt. As she stepped inside, she found him sitting behind his massive oak desk, his eyes cold and calculating as always. But today, something was different. His usual air of confidence was tinged with tension, and Lily could sense that whatever he had to say wasn't going to be good. "Lily," he began, his voice measured, "we need to talk." Lily sat down in the chair across from him, crossing her legs and forcing a smile. "What's on your mind, Daniel?" He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "I've been hearing things, rumors, about you." Lily's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her expression neutral. "Rumors? What kind of rumors?" Daniel's eyes narrowed, his gaze piercing through her. "People are talking about what happened with Richard, about how you were involved in his downfall, and now they're starting to wonder if you're playing the same game with me." Lily's stomach tightened. She had expected the whispers, but hearing them from Daniel's mouth made them all the more real. "That's ridiculous," she said smoothly. "You know how people love to gossip. They're just jealous of what we've built together." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Maybe," he said finally, "but I can't afford to take any chances." Lily felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Daniel replied, his voice cold, "that I need to know I can trust you. I need to know that you're not going to turn on me the way you did with Richard." Lily's heart raced. This was a test, one she couldn't afford to fail. She leaned forward, her eyes locking with his. "I've always been loyal to you, Daniel. Everything I've done has been for us." Daniel's gaze softened slightly, but the tension in the room remained. "Then prove it," he said. "Prove that I can trust you." Lily hesitated, unsure of what he was asking. "How?" Daniel stood up, walking around the desk to stand in front of her. "There's someone I need you to deal with, someone who's been causing problems for me. If you can handle this, then we can move forward. But if you can't..." He let the sentence hang in the air, the implication clear. Lily swallowed hard. She had played many roles in her life, but this, whatever Daniel was asking, felt different, more dangerous, more final. But she couldn't back down now, not after everything she had sacrificed to get here. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steady. Daniel smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "There's a man, Ethan Porter. He's been making moves against me, trying to undermine my business. I need you to get close to him, find out what he knows, and take care of it." Lily's mind raced. She had dealt with powerful men before, manipulated them to her advantage. But this was different. Daniel wasn't just asking her to seduce someone or gather information. He was asking her to eliminate a threat, and for the first time, Lily wondered if she had gone too far. But she couldn't let Daniel see her hesitation. She forced a smile, standing up to meet his gaze. "Consider it done." As she left his office, Lily felt the weight of the mask she had worn for so long pressing down on her. She had become an expert at pretending, at hiding her true self behind layers of charm and manipulation. But now, she wasn't sure if she could keep it up much longer. The mask was cracking, and beneath it, Lily wasn't sure who she really was anymore. Lily's reflection stared back at her from the bathroom mirror, a haunting image of a woman she barely recognized. Her emerald eyes were sharp, calculating, but behind them lurked something deeper: fear. Fear of what she had become, fear of the task Daniel had given her, and fear that, for the first time, she was no longer in control. She took a deep breath, splashed cold water on her face, and forced herself to focus. She had faced difficult situations before and always managed to come out on top. But this, getting close to Ethan Porter, Daniel's new enemy, and then taking care of it, was a different game, a more dangerous one. And yet, she had no choice. Daniel's trust was on the line, and with it, her entire life. Lily had never killed anyone, manipulated, seduced, and ruined lives. Yes, but never had she crossed the line that Daniel was now asking her to step over. She had never allowed herself to think of herself as someone capable of violence. Yet, here she was, considering the unimaginable. Ethan Porter. A name that seemed innocuous enough, but Lily knew better. She had heard whispers about him, an up-and-coming entrepreneur with a sharp mind and a reputation for being as ruthless as Daniel. If Daniel was worried about him, then Ethan was a real threat, and that meant he wouldn't be easy to manipulate. But Lily was determined to succeed. She had come too far, sacrificed too much to let fear or guilt stop her now. A week later, Lily found herself at an upscale charity auction, one of the many events where the city's elite gathered under the pretense of goodwill while making backroom deals and flaunting their wealth. Daniel had arranged for Ethan Porter to be there, and it was Lily's job to introduce herself, to begin the process of seduction. As she walked into the grand ballroom, her eyes scanned the crowd, searching for him. The room glittered with opulence, the wealthy attendees adorned in designer gowns and tailored suits, their laughter echoing through the high ceilings. Lily fit right in, her black silk dress clinging to her in all the right places, her hair swept up in an elegant twist. But beneath her polished exterior, her mind was racing. And then she saw him. Ethan stood near the bar, a drink in hand, his posture relaxed yet alert. He was younger than she had expected, probably in his late 30s, with a lean, athletic build and sharp features that gave him a predatory air. His dark hair was neatly styled, and his piercing blue eyes seemed to take in everything around him with careful calculation. He exuded confidence, but there was an edge to him, something dangerous lurking just beneath the surface. Lily had met men like him before, men who saw the world as a game to be won, men who took what they wanted without hesitation. But Ethan was different from Daniel. While Daniel was cold and calculating, Ethan's presence radiated a quiet intensity. He was someone who thrived on control, and Lily knew that if she wasn't careful, she could easily become prey rather than the predator. Taking a deep breath, Lily approached the bar, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. She ordered a glass of champagne, her eyes casually drifting toward Ethan. She waited for him to notice her, to make the first move. It didn't take long. Champagne at an auction? Ethan's voice was smooth, with just a hint of amusement. Classy. Lily smiled, turning to face him fully. It's a classic, she replied, raising her glass in a small toast. I prefer simplicity. Ethan's eyes flickered with interest as he studied her. I'm not sure I'd describe you as simple. Lily let out a soft laugh, leaning slightly closer. I suppose you're right. I've never been one for being predictable. Ethan's lips curled into a smirk. I like that. Predictability is boring. They exchanged a few more pleasantries, their conversation light but laced with tension. Lily knew how to play this game, how to keep him interested without giving too much away. She could feel his curiosity growing, could see the way his eyes lingered on her, trying to figure her out. But Lily had learned long ago how to be a mystery, how to reveal only what was necessary to draw a man in. After a while, Ethan leaned against the bar, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her. I don't think we've met before, he said, his tone casual, but Lily could hear the suspicion underneath. She smiled, taking a sip of her champagne. No, I don't believe we have. I'm Lily. Ethan, he replied, offering his hand. She took it, feeling the firm strength of his grip, and held his gaze for just a second too long before letting go. So, what brings you here tonight, Ethan? She asked, tilting her head slightly as if genuinely curious. Ethan shrugged, his gaze sharp. Business, mostly. These events are good for networking. Lily nodded, her expression thoughtful. And who are you networking with? Ethan chuckled softly, but his eyes remained guarded. I guess that depends on who's worth my time. Lily raised an eyebrow, her smile widening. And am I worth your time? For a moment, Ethan didn't respond. He studied her, his gaze probing, as if trying to see beyond her carefully crafted mask. "I guess we'll find out," he said finally, his voice low. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversation, drinks, and subtle flirtation. Ethan was smart, charming, and far more perceptive than Lily had expected. He didn't fall easily into her traps, didn't immediately reveal his weaknesses, but he was intrigued by her, and that was enough. She had planted the seed. As the night drew to a close, Ethan slipped a card into her hand, his fingers brushing lightly against hers. "Call me," he said, his voice smooth and confident. "We should talk again." Lily smiled, slipping the card into her purse. "I look forward to it." As she watched him walk away, her heart pounded in her chest. She had succeeded in making the first move, but she knew that this was just the beginning. Ethan Porter wasn't like the other men she had manipulated. He was dangerous, and if she wasn't careful, this game could cost her more than she had bargained for. In the days that followed, Lily and Ethan's relationship grew. They met for drinks, dinners, and eventually, more private encounters. Ethan was cautious, always keeping his guard up, but Lily was patient. She played her part perfectly, engaging, mysterious, and always just out of reach. She let Ethan think he was the one pursuing her, let him believe that he was in control. But all the while, Lily was gathering information, learning about his business dealings, his rivals, and his plans. She knew that Daniel was watching closely, waiting for her to deliver what he needed. And as much as she despised the hold he had over her, she knew that failing him wasn't an option. It wasn't long before Lily found the leverage she needed. Ethan had made a few risky investments, and there were whispers of a deal that could either make or break his empire. She fed this information back to Daniel, careful not to let Ethan suspect anything. She was playing a dangerous game, one where a single misstep could unravel everything. But even as she moved closer to accomplishing her mission, something unexpected happened. Lily began to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time: guilt. Ethan wasn't like Richard. He wasn't an easy mark, and he wasn't blindly falling for her charms. He was smart, calculating, and in some ways, just as ruthless as she was. But as she spent more time with him, Lily realized that Ethan was also driven by something deeper, a need to prove himself, to succeed on his own terms, without relying on anyone else. In him, she saw a reflection of herself, and for the first time, she questioned whether she could go through with Daniel's plan. But it was too late to turn back now. The night before she was supposed to meet with Daniel to finalize their plan, Lily lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Ethan slept soundly beside her, unaware of the betrayal she was about to deliver. She had never allowed herself to get close to anyone, had always kept her emotions locked away. But now, as she lay beside him, the weight of what she was about to do pressed down on her chest, suffocating her. She had promised herself that she would never let guilt or sentimentality get in the way of her success. But now, as she faced the reality of what was about to happen, she realized that the cost of her rise to power was far greater than she had ever anticipated. The masks she had worn for so long were beginning to crack, and beneath them, Lily wasn't sure who she was anymore. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of city lights filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Lily lay in bed, her heart heavy with the decision she was about to make. Ethan slept beside her, unaware of the storm brewing inside her. For years, Lily had mastered the art of manipulation, seduction, and control. She had played the role of the powerful, untouchable woman. But now, as she stared at the ceiling, a hollow ache gnawed at her insides. Guilt was something Lily had never allowed herself to feel before. She had always been able to detach herself from the consequences of her actions, to distance herself from the lives she destroyed. But Ethan was different. He was a mirror, reflecting back the same ambition, the same hunger for power that had driven her for so long. And that reflection had shaken her to her core. She turned to look at him, his face peaceful in sleep, the sharp angles of his jaw softened in the dim light. For the first time in years, Lily felt something stir in her that she hadn't expected. Doubt. Doubt about her choices, doubt about who she had become, and doubt about whether the life she had built was worth the price she was about to pay. The emptiness that had followed her for so long was beginning to consume her, threatening to unravel everything she had worked for. She had thought that wealth, power, and influence would fill the void inside her, but the more she took, the deeper the emptiness grew. No matter how many lives she disrupted, no matter how much luxury surrounded her, it was never enough. The more she climbed, the more she realized that she was chasing a hollow victory. And now, with Ethan, she was faced with a choice. Go through with Daniel's plan and cement her place in the upper echelons of power, or walk away and risk losing everything. Lily sat up slowly, her mind racing. She couldn't sleep, couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of a precipice, about to make a decision that would define the rest of her life. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Ethan, and padded silently into the living room. The view from the windows was breathtaking. The city spread out beneath her, glittering like a sea of jewels. It was everything she had ever wanted, and yet it felt meaningless. She poured herself a glass of wine, her hands trembling slightly. The taste of the rich red liquid felt bitter on her tongue. She had tasted success, had risen to heights she had once thought impossible, but the cost of that success was beginning to weigh heavily on her soul. Every decision she had made, every man she had seduced, every family she had broken, it had all led to this moment. And now, standing at the pinnacle of power, she felt more lost than ever. As she stood there, the door to the bedroom creaked open, and Ethan appeared in the doorway, his expression groggy but concerned. "Lily?" he asked, his voice rough from sleep. "What's wrong?" Lily turned to face him, her heart aching at the sight of him. She wanted to tell him everything, to confess the truth about why she had entered his life, about Daniel's plan to destroy him. But she couldn't. She had come too far, and the stakes were too high. "I couldn't sleep," she said softly, forcing a smile. "Too much on my mind?" Ethan walked over to her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her close. "You've been distant lately," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Is there something you're not telling me?" Lily stiffened in his embrace, the weight of her secrets threatening to crush her. She had always been so good at keeping her emotions in check, but now, with Ethan standing so close, she felt vulnerable in a way she hadn't felt in years. She shook her head, pulling away from him gently. "It's just work," she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. "You know how it is." Ethan studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes searching hers as if he could sense the turmoil inside her. But then he sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "Yeah, I know," he said, his voice resigned. "We all have our demons, don't we?" Lily smiled sadly, turning back toward the window. "Yeah," she whispered, "we do." The next morning, Lily found herself back at Daniel's office, her stomach twisted in knots. She had delayed this meeting as long as she could, hoping that somehow a solution would present itself. But Daniel wasn't the kind of man to wait. He was a predator, always watching, always expecting results. As she entered his office, Daniel was sitting behind his desk, his eyes as cold and calculating as ever. He didn't bother with pleasantries, didn't ask how she was doing. He simply gestured for her to sit, his expression expectant. "Well?" he asked, his voice sharp. "Do you have what I need?" Lily swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had gathered enough information about Ethan to give Daniel what he wanted. But as she sat there, staring at the man who had controlled so much of her life, a wave of revulsion washed over her. She hated him, hated the way he used people, the way he manipulated them for his own gain, and hated the fact that, for so long, she had been just like him. But now, sitting across from him, Lily realized something. She didn't want to be like Daniel anymore. "I can't do this," she said suddenly, her voice trembling slightly. Daniel's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "What did you say?" "I can't do it," Lily repeated, her voice growing steadier. "I won't." For a moment there was silence. Daniel's cold blue eyes bored into hers, and Lily braced herself for the fallout. She'd expected anger, fury, maybe even threats. But instead, Daniel simply leaned back in his chair, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "You're not serious," he said, his tone laced with amusement. "You've come this far, and now you're having second thoughts?" Lily's heart raced, but she held her ground. "I've done everything you've asked, but this is too far." Daniel's smile faded, and his expression hardened. "You knew what this was from the beginning, Lily. You knew what it would take to get where you are. And now you want to back out?" Lily's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. "I'm not like you," she said through gritted teeth. I won't destroy someone just because you tell me to. Daniel stood, his presence towering over her as he walked around the desk. He stopped in front of her, his eyes cold and menacing. You think you can walk away from this? He asked, his voice low and dangerous. After everything I've done for you? Lily's pulse quickened, but she refused to back down. I'm done, she said firmly, standing up to face him. Whatever happens, I'm done. For a long moment, Daniel simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. And then, without warning, he laughed, a cold, cruel sound that sent a shiver down Lily's spine. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice soft but laced with menace. People like us don't get to walk away. You'll come crawling back, Lily, and when you do, I won't be so generous. Lily didn't respond. She turned on her heel and walked out of the office, her heart pounding in her chest. She had made her decision, and there was no turning back now. She had no idea what would happen next, no idea how Daniel would retaliate, but she didn't care. For the first time in years, Lily felt free. But as she stepped out into the cold morning air, a familiar emptiness settled over her. She had walked away from Daniel, from the life she had built, but the void inside her remained. She had spent so long chasing power, success, and wealth, but none of it had filled the hole that had been growing inside her since her childhood. As she walked through the crowded streets, Lily realized the truth she had been running from for so long. No matter how far she climbed, no matter how much she took, the emptiness would always be there. And nothing, no amount of money, power, or control could ever fill it. The days following Lily's confrontation with Daniel felt like walking on thin ice. Each step was fraught with uncertainty, the tension in the air crackling like an oncoming storm. She had made her choice, but with it came the looming question of how long she had before Daniel retaliated. Men like him didn't take betrayal lightly, and she knew she had struck a blow to both his pride and his control. Lily kept a low profile, avoiding the usual social events and gatherings where Daniel's presence loomed large. She distanced herself from the circles of power she once craved, slipping into the background, waiting for the consequences of her defiance to catch up with her. But it wasn't Daniel who came for her. It was Ethan. It had been weeks since she last saw him, the night they had shared still lingering in her mind. She had vanished from his life without explanation, disappearing into the shadows to avoid putting him in Daniel's crosshairs. She thought she had spared him from the fallout of her decisions. But now, as she stood in the doorway of her apartment and saw him there, his face hard with anger and betrayal, she realized that she had underestimated the damage she had done. Ethan, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She had no idea how he had found her, but here he was, standing on her doorstep, his expression a mixture of hurt and fury. You thought you could just disappear? His voice was cold, each word laced with accusation. After everything, you thought I wouldn't come looking for answers? Lily swallowed hard, her mind racing as she tried to formulate a response. She had expected Daniel's wrath, but she hadn't anticipated that Ethan would come looking for her, let alone confront her like this. It's not what you think. Not what I think. Ethan cut her off, stepping closer. His presence filled the room with an intensity she hadn't seen in him before. You used me, Lily. You made me believe that you... His voice cracked for just a moment, his control faltering before he regained his composure. You played me like a fool. Lily flinched at the raw emotion in his voice. She had always been able to keep her conquests at arm's length, treating them as mere stepping stones on her path to power. But with Ethan, it had been different. She hadn't planned on feeling anything for him, hadn't expected the guilt, the connection that had formed between them. And now, that connection was unraveling before her eyes. I never meant to hurt you, she said softly, her voice trembling. It started as just a game, yes, but it became something more. Ethan laughed bitterly, shaking his head. Something more? You were working with Daniel, weren't you? You were feeding him information about me the whole time. Lily's silence was answer enough. I trusted you, Lily, he continued, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and pain. I let you in, and you betrayed me. The weight of his words pressed down on her, suffocating her with the truth she could no longer deny. She had betrayed him, just as she had betrayed so many others before him. But this time, it felt different. This time, the guilt wasn't so easy to brush aside. I didn't have a choice, Lily whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Daniel, he would have destroyed me if I didn't go along with his plan. Ethan's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. So you chose to destroy me instead. The words cut through her like a knife, and for a moment, Lily was paralyzed by the weight of her own guilt. She had always prided herself on her ability to manipulate, to control the people around her. But with Ethan, she had lost control. She had allowed herself to feel something, and now it was unraveling everything she had built. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. It was the first time in years that she had uttered those words and meant them. "I never wanted this." Ethan's gaze softened for just a moment, but the anger quickly returned. "Sorry isn't enough, Lily. You've ruined everything." He turned away from her, pacing the room, his frustration palpable. "Daniel has already made his move," he said bitterly. "He's trying to destroy everything I've worked for, and it's because of you." Lily's heart sank. She had known that Daniel wouldn't let Ethan walk away unscathed, but hearing it from Ethan's own mouth made the consequences of her actions all too real. She had thought she could walk away from Daniel, but now, the full weight of her betrayal was crashing down around her. "I can help you," Lily said suddenly, her voice desperate. "I can make this right." Ethan stopped, turning to face her with a look of disbelief. "Help me? After everything you've done, you think you can help me?" Lily nodded, stepping toward him, her heart pounding in her chest. "I know how Daniel operates. I know his weaknesses. I can help you take him down." Ethan's eyes narrowed, his expression skeptical. "Why should I trust you?" It was a valid question, one that Lily had no easy answer for. She had betrayed him, lied to him, used him for her own gain. But now, as she stood before him, vulnerable and exposed, she realized that this was her chance to make amends. Not just for Ethan, but for everything she had done. "Because I'm done with him," she said, her voice steady. "I'm done with all of it, and I want to make things right." For a long moment, Ethan said nothing, his gaze locked on hers as if searching for any sign of deception. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and measured. "If you're lying to me, if this is just another one of your games—" "It's not," Lily interrupted, her voice firm. "I swear." Ethan studied her for a long moment before finally nodding, his shoulders relaxing just slightly. "All right," he said, his voice cautious. "We'll do this your way. But if you betray me again, I won't hesitate to destroy you." Lily nodded, her heart racing. She knew that this was her last chance to redeem herself, her last chance to undo the damage she had caused. And she was determined not to let it slip away. The next few days were a whirlwind of planning and strategizing. Lily and Ethan worked together, their shared goal of taking down Daniel, uniting them in a way that felt both strange and familiar. It was the first time in years that Lily had felt like she was part of something bigger than herself, the first time she wasn't playing both sides for her own gain. But the closer they got to their goal, the more dangerous things became. Daniel wasn't an easy man to outmaneuver, and as they dug deeper into his dealings, they realized just how far his reach extended. He had allies in places they hadn't expected, and taking him down would require precision and cunning. As the day of their final confrontation approached, the tension between Lily and Ethan grew. Their partnership was fragile, built on a foundation of broken trust, but somehow it held. And through it all, Lily found herself drawn to Ethan in a way she hadn't expected. There was something about the way he looked at her now, something that told her he was starting to see beyond the mask she had worn for so long. But there was no time for sentimentality. The stakes were too high. The night of their confrontation with Daniel arrived. Lily and Ethan had planned every detail, every step of their strategy. They would expose him, ruin his reputation, and dismantle his empire piece by piece. But as they stood outside Daniel's office, ready to confront the man who had controlled so much of their lives, Lily felt a cold dread settle over her. This was the moment she had been working toward for so long, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure if she could go through with it. The cost of victory seemed too high, the consequences too permanent. But there was no turning back now. As they stepped into the office, Daniel was waiting for them, his cold blue eyes glinting with amusement. He didn't seem surprised to see them, and that sent a chill down Lily's spine. He had always been one step ahead, always in control. Well, Daniel said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I was wondering when you'd come crawling back, Lily." Lily's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. This was the moment. She had to see it through. Ethan stepped forward, his voice steady and calm. "It's over, Daniel. We have everything we need to expose you." Daniel's smile didn't falter. In fact, it seemed to grow wider. "Do you really think you can take me down?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "You have no idea what you're up against." Lily's heart raced as Daniel's words sank in. There was something in his tone, something that told her they had underestimated him. And in that moment, she realized that their carefully laid plan might not be enough. Chapter 10, Falling from Grace. Daniel's cold smile sent a shiver down Lily's spine. She had always known he was dangerous, but standing there in his office with his eyes gleaming and his body language exuding unshakable confidence, the reality of just how far out of their depth she and Ethan were hit her all at once. "You think you can just walk in here and threaten me?" Daniel's voice was laced with mockery, and he leaned back in his chair, casually gesturing to the papers spread out on his desk. "I've been doing this a lot longer than either of you, and trust me, if I go down, I'll make sure you're both dragged down with me." Ethan didn't flinch, but Lily could feel the tension in him as he stood beside her, ready for whatever was about to happen. She had hoped that this confrontation would be clean, that they could take Daniel down quickly and leave before things escalated. But now she realized that was a fantasy. Daniel wasn't going to let them walk away that easily. "We have evidence," Ethan said firmly, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "We know about the offshore accounts, the bribes, the people you've blackmailed to build your empire. All of it." Daniel's smirk deepened. "Evidence?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "Evidence is a funny thing, isn't it? It's only worth something if the right people see it." He stood up, towering over them now, his presence even more menacing. "And I've spent years making sure the right people are in my pocket. You really think you can just bring me down with a few documents?" Lily's heart sank. She had known that Daniel was powerful, but hearing him lay it out so plainly, the depth of his influence felt insurmountable. He wasn't just a man with money. He had woven himself into the fabric of the city's elite, corrupting those in power until they owed him everything. He wasn't just untouchable, he was dangerous. But she couldn't let fear control her. She had come too far to turn back now. "I'm not scared of you, Daniel," Lily said, her voice steady, even though inside she was trembling. "You don't control me anymore." Daniel turned his icy gaze on her, his smile faltering for the first time. "Don't be so sure of that," he said quietly, his voice dripping with menace. "You've spent years playing this game, and you've done well for yourself. But if you think you can outmaneuver me, you're mistaken. You've always been a pawn in this, Lily. You were useful, but that's all you ever were." Lily's chest tightened. His words cut deep, reminding her of every moment she had spent trying to rise above the role she had been assigned, trying to become more than just a tool in the hands of powerful men. But this time, she wasn't going to let him control the narrative. "Maybe I was a pawn," she said, her voice gaining strength, "but not anymore." Ethan stepped forward, sliding a folder across Daniel's desk. "We're not bluffing," he said. "This is real. If you don't back down, everything you've built will come crashing down. The media, the authorities, there are still people you don't control, and they'll come for you." For a moment, Daniel stared at the folder, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he reached for it, opening it with an air of indifference. He flipped through the pages, his face betraying nothing, but Lily could see the tension building in his posture. When he finally closed the folder, his eyes darkened, and the room seemed to grow colder. "You think this is going to save you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think you've won?" Lily and Ethan exchanged a glance, unsure of what Daniel was planning. But before they could react, Daniel pressed a button on his desk, and the door behind them swung open. Two large men stepped into the room, their faces expressionless, their intentions clear. "Get them out of my sight," Daniel ordered, his voice cold and final. Panic surged through Lily, but she didn't have time to process it before one of the men grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. Ethan tried to resist, but the other man had already taken hold of him, dragging him out of the office with a brutal efficiency. Lily struggled, her heart pounding in her chest as they were forced down the hallway, the reality of their situation sinking in. Daniel wasn't going to play by their rules. He had the upper hand, and now they were at his mercy. They were taken to the basement of the building, a dark, damp space that reeked of decay and secrets best left hidden. The men shoved them into a small windowless room and locked the door behind them. The echo of the door slamming shut sent a wave of dread through Lily. She collapsed onto the floor, her mind racing. They were trapped. Daniel had won. For a long moment, the silence between her and Ethan was heavy, both of them reeling from what had just happened. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice filled with frustration and anger. "I should have known he'd pull something like this. I thought we had him." Lily stared at the ground, her thoughts spiraling. "I thought we did too," she whispered, "but he's always one step ahead." Ethan paced the small room, running his hands through his hair, his mind clearly racing. "We need to get out of here," he muttered. "We need to figure out a way to." But Lily cut him off, her voice trembling. "Even if we do get out, what then? Daniel's made it clear that he won't stop until we're destroyed." Ethan stopped pacing, turning to face her. "We'll find another way," he said firmly. "We'll expose him." Lily shook her head, her chest tightening with despair. "I've spent years running from the truth, Ethan. We can't beat him. Not like this." Ethan knelt down beside her, his voice softening. "We can't give up, Lily. Not now." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears she had fought so hard to hold back. "I'm tired, Ethan. I'm tired of fighting, of playing this game. It's cost me everything." For a moment, Ethan didn't say anything. Then, gently, he reached out and took her hand in his. "You don't have to do this alone anymore," he said quietly. "We're in this together." Lily stared at him, her heart aching. She had spent so long manipulating others, using them for her own gain, that she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone stand beside her without expecting anything in return. Ethan wasn't just another conquest. He wasn't someone she could easily discard. And now, in this moment, she realized that she didn't want to. "I don't know if I can keep going," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan squeezed her hand gently, his gaze steady. "You're stronger than you think, Lily. We'll find a way out of this, together." For the first time in years, Lily felt something other than emptiness. She felt hope. It was fragile, barely more than a flicker, but it was there, and it was enough to keep her going. The next few hours were a blur of planning and quiet conversation as Lily and Ethan tried to figure out their next move. They knew they had to get out of Daniel's clutches, but they also knew that escaping wouldn't be enough. They needed to find a way to expose him, to bring down his empire once and for all. As the hours ticked by, the door to the basement room finally creaked open, and the same two men who had dragged them down here stepped inside. "Time's up," one of them said gruffly. "Let's go." Lily's heart raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was their chance. Whatever Daniel had planned, she and Ethan would be ready. They were led back upstairs to Daniel's office, where he sat behind his desk, his expression cold and impassive. The folder of evidence still lay untouched in front of him. "I've decided to make you an offer," Daniel said, his voice unnervingly calm. Lily's pulse quickened. This wasn't the reaction she had expected. "You walk away," Daniel continued, leaning forward slightly. "Disappear, leave the city, and I'll let you live. But if you stay, if you keep trying to come after me, I will destroy you both. Your lives, your reputations, everything you've built will crumble." Lily's mind raced. Walking away would mean giving up everything, but staying would mean risking everything. She glanced at Ethan, searching his face for guidance. But before either of them could respond, Daniel spoke again, his eyes locking onto Lily's. "This is your only chance, Lily. Choose wisely." The weight of the decision pressed down on her, and for the first time in her life, Lily didn't know what to do. The power she had once wielded felt distant, slipping through her fingers. She had fought so hard to rise to the top, but now, standing on the edge of destruction, she wasn't sure if it had been worth it. Her rise had come at a cost, one that she wasn't sure she could keep paying. Taking a deep breath, Lily made her choice. "I'm done," she said softly, her voice steady. "I'm done playing your game, Daniel." For a moment, there was silence. Then slowly, Daniel's cold smile returned. "Then you've made your decision." Lily and Ethan were escorted out of the building, and as they stepped into the cool night air, a strange sense of relief washed over her. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was the first step toward something new. For the first time in years, Lily wasn't chasing power. She wasn't manipulating, wasn't destroying. She was walking away. And as she walked beside Ethan, her hand still tightly gripping his, she realized that sometimes walking away was the bravest thing you could do. The end.